In August of 2017, a 39-year-old hiker from Idaho, Michael Harrison, set out on a lone hike in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. He was planning a 3-day hike along a trail leading to Lake Chelan and was supposed to return home by Sunday. However, he never made it home. 5 years passed. In the summer of 2022, a team of loggers was working in a remote area of the forest not far from where Harrison was last seen. There, under a thick layer of moss and soil, they came across a round, rusted manhole cover sunk into a concrete slab. The cover had to be removed as a group. The metal was held in place by old hinges and did not give way immediately. When it eventually slid aside, a stifling smell of dampness escaped from the dark opening. It was this hatch that got the case of the mysterious disappearance of the tourist off the ground. In August of 2017, 39-year-old Idaho resident Michael Harrison went on a lonely trip to the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. For him, it was not a random idea, but a well-thought-out route that he planned in advance. Colleagues described him as a meticulous person. He knew how to prepare for hiking trips in such a way as to foresee every little thing. Michael worked in information technology, had a quiet life and a loving family, but he went hiking several times a year to recuperate and feel the distance from his daily routine. The Cascade Mountains were a familiar place for him. In previous years, he had hiked short routes there with friends. Now, he wanted to hike a 3-day stretch of the trail leading to Lake Chelan. It was a national park area, popular with tourists, but remote enough to feel lonely. Michael left on Friday morning, leaving his wife a message that he would be back by Sunday. He always warned his family when he went to the mountains and never broke his own rules. He left his car in the parking lot at the official entrance to the park. He was seen by other hikers who were climbing the same day. Harrison looked confident and well-equipped. He had a new backpack, tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, GPS navigator, map, several flashlights, food, and water. Everything showed that he knew what he was doing and had enough experience. That evening, according to other hikers, Michael set up camp in one of the small clearings near the trail. His tent was separate but not too far from the others. People noted that he greeted them, set up his things, and then did not make contact. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior. He looked focused and calm. The night passed uneventfully. Only the usual sounds for these places could be heard: wind, tree noise, and occasionally the cries of wild birds. The next morning, however, something changed. Tourists camping nearby noticed that Harrison's tent was still intact, with his belongings inside, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one attached any importance to this. In the mountains, it is common to get up early, go for a walk, or pick berries. It might have seemed that he had just gone out for a few hours, but as time passed, his anxiety grew. His backpack was lying next to his tent, along with some leftover food, his phone, and his documents. It was unusual for a seasoned hiker to set out without the essentials. His sleeping bag remained neatly rolled up, and his water bottles were under the tent. There was nothing to indicate that he was going on a long journey without his belongings. Several neighboring travelers tried to remember if they had seen him in the morning. One man said he had heard footsteps before dawn, but was not sure if it was Harrison. Another recalled the sound of a motor somewhere deep in the forest, as if an old car was running. But official roads were far away, and the witness could not specify what it was. These little things seemed unimportant at the time. By lunchtime, it became clear Michael was not coming back. His camp was still in order, with things lying around as if he planned to leave for just a few minutes. The longer the day went on, the stranger the situation seemed. It's easy to get lost in the mountains, but usually people take at least a compass or food with them. Here, everything was left in place. As the sun began to set, the The neighbors in the camp became completely worried. They came closer and saw that his phone, wallet with documents, food, and even a map and navigator were in the tent. Everything looked as if the owner was about to return, but he didn't come back either in an hour or two. The forest was getting darker, and the feeling was spreading among the tourists that the disappearance could no longer be explained by a simple walk. The family would be informed later, but for now, the only fact was that the man had disappeared without a trace. He was seen in the evening, lying down in a tent, but in the morning he did not return to his equipment. The same number of people walked the same path. No one noticed anything strange, and only the tent, intact and untouched, remained a silent reminder that its owner had disappeared on a night when everything seemed normal. Michael Harrison's disappearance was officially reported the day after neighboring hikers discovered his empty tent. This was not uncommon for the national park. Every year, several people get lost in remote areas. However, there was something strange about this case from the very beginning. The man disappeared literally in front of other vacationers, and his belongings remained untouched. The search operation started quickly. In the first hours, rangers and several volunteers from the local community joined the work. They walked the nearest trails, checked a ravine nearby, and small streams where the accident could have happened. But within a day, it became clear that much more effort would be needed. Dog handlers were involved in the search. The dogs had to pick up the trail of things left in the tent. They took to the trail several times and walked confidently away from the camp. But after about 100 meters, the trail disappeared. In a rocky area between two groups of trees, the scent stopped, and the dogs got confused, circling around as if they had lost their bearings. This was unusual. In cases when a person gets lost in the mountains, the route can be traced for kilometers ahead. In this case, it felt as if the man had just been pulled out of space. By the end of the first week, the operation turned into a large-scale one. Air reconnaissance was brought in. Several helicopters with thermal imagers flew over the nearest ridges. No signals were detected that could correspond to a person. Rescuers checked streams and cliffs and set up a base camp for coordination. Harrison's family traveled from Idaho and waited for news every day, but there was no news. The only real clue was a narrow strip of crumpled bushes near an inconspicuous forest road that led off the official route. There they found several shoe prints that could have belonged to the missing man, but the footprints stretched for only a few meters and suddenly broke off on stones. After that, there was nothing. No traces of dragging or falling. It looked as if he had simply stopped walking. The dogs led the searchers to this very point and then helplessly circled around, finding no continuation. For the rescuers, it was even more disturbing than if they hadn't found anything at all. The place looked too calm, but at the same time, it didn't give an answer. Several volunteers recalled hearing a distant engine noise, similar to an old van, while combing. The sound came from a road that was officially considered closed. The police recorded these accounts, but at the time, they had no concrete confirmation. In the mountains, time is against the searchers. A few days later, the weather changed. It started to rain, which washed away many possible traces. Water flows eroded the soil, and the wind carried the scents, which were already weak for dogs. The chances of finding any trace were decreasing with each passing hour. The rescuers covered an area of more than 50 square kilometers. It was exhausting work. They crossed ravine after ravine, checked caves, and inspected old forest roads. Each group returned with the same report. Nothing. No fragments of equipment, clothes, even small personal items. Usually, people who get lost leave behind at least something: a broken branch, a wrapper, a print in the soil. In this case, it looked as if the person had simply disappeared from the surface of the earth. After 2 weeks of active operation, the resource began to run out. The volunteers returned to their work, and the equipment was taken away for other tasks. Officials calculated the costs and decided to cut back on the work. The report stated that there were no signs that the missing man was still alive in the area, and there were no traces worth pursuing. This came as a blow to the family. Michael's wife and parents convinced him that the search should continue. They insisted he was an experienced hiker, he had equipment, and even if he was in trouble, his body must be somewhere. But the official line was different. In the absence of evidence, continuing the operation meant only wasting resources. By the end of September, the case was effectively frozen. All the maps and routes were put into a separate volume, where it was clearly marked. The only clue is a crumpled strip of bushes and a broken trail. Thus began a period of uncertainty that lasted for years. Those who participated in the search later recalled this operation as one of the most mysterious. It provided no explanation, no traces of a struggle, no hint of wild animals, no hint of escape. It was as if Michael Harrison had simply disappeared into the trees. When the search operation exhausted its resources, the police moved on to the formal stage of the investigation. The case of Michael Harrison was officially classified as a disappearance without signs of a crime. This meant that law enforcement did not have sufficient grounds to consider him a victim of violence. The logic was simple. No body was found, there were no signs of a struggle or abduction, and people disappear in the mountains every year due to falls, weather conditions, or loss of orientation. Internal reports indicated several possible scenarios. The most likely, according to investigators, is disorientation. Harrison could have strayed from the trail, gotten lost in the thicket, gone into a ravine, or fallen on a rocky outcrop where he had a fatal fall. Another possibility is that he was attacked by a wild animal, such as a black bear or cougar. Although there are few such cases in this region, they could not be completely ruled out. The third scenario was a sudden medical emergency, a heart attack or loss of consciousness, after which the body was left in an area that the searchers had circled. For the police, this was enough to close the active phase and transfer the case to the archival category. In official statements, the department's representatives were dry. Everything points to an accident. Further action is possible only if new evidence emerges. Harrison's family strongly disagreed with this. For them, the situation looked different. They knew Michael as a disciplined person who never deviated from safety rules. His wife emphasized, he always kept his documents with him even on a short walk. He never left his phone on, even if there was no signal. It was a matter of principle. It was obvious to his family that voluntarily leaving without his belongings was not in keeping with his habits. The fact that the equipment was left in the tent seemed especially suspicious. Hikers who accidentally get lost or into trouble usually take at least a minimal set with them: water, a flashlight, a map. Here, everything was in place. The family insisted that this was evidence of either sudden outside interference or coercion. Despite their arguments, the system worked by inertia. The police had no evidence of a crime, so the case gradually went cold. At that time, the department had dozens of similar files: the disappearance of climbers, hunters, and travelers. Michael became another entry in the statistics. The only detail that could have changed the situation, the mention of a white van, was also quickly dismissed. The witness was a local forester known for his alcohol problems. His testimony was received with skepticism. In the report, they wrote, "Probably saw a vehicle belonging to local residents. Not confirmed." For the investigators, this was not sufficiently significant to develop the kidnapping theory. Over the following months, the case increasingly faded into the background. The family tried to attract the attention of the media, appealed to public organizations, but interest quickly waned. The news stories held attention for a few weeks, after which the topic lost its relevance. For the general public, it was just another story about a missing tourist. For Michael's wife and parents, the situation looked different. They refused to accept the official version. Their words were full of anger. You call it an accident just because it's more convenient for you. They continued to collect information on their own to talk to those who were in the park that day. Everything they found only strengthened their conviction that it could not have been an accident. Over time, hope was found in small things. The family believes in signs. Someone saw a photo of a similar person in another state online. Someone wrote that they had heard stories about strange cars in the forests of Washington. None of this has been confirmed. The official line remained unchanged. Michael Harrison most likely died in the wilderness, and his body was not found due to terrain and weather conditions. For 2 years after the disappearance, the case was opened only formally, when single signals were received. Nothing was confirmed. For the police, it was a case with no prospects. For the family, it was a wound that would not heal. They felt that the system had simply written Michael off as a statistic without trying to get to the bottom of the truth. Thus began the slow cooling of the case. In the archives, it was labeled as a missing person. The date of disappearance, a brief description of the route, a list of things found in the tent. Not a word about suspicion of a crime, just lines in a database that few people read. At that time, the Cascade Mountains were living their own lives. New tourists came to the same trails where Harrison was last seen, not even realizing that a person had disappeared. For them, it was just a picturesque area, but for the family, it was the place where their son and husband's trail disappeared. The official version was simple, an accident. But for the family, it was like a verdict without evidence. When the official search was winding down, another protocol was added to the case file. It wasn't as obvious as the footprints on the ground or the testimony of the tourists, but it attracted the attention of several investigators. The testimony was given by a Forest Service employee who was patrolling the park's outskirts on those days. He said that he saw a white van, similar to an old Ford Econoline, parked on a closed road near the area of the disappearance. The vehicle was stationary, and he thought it was strange that someone had driven there at all. The road had not been officially used for years, and access was limited. The forester claimed to have seen a silhouette inside the cab, but he could not make out the license plate, and described the vehicle in general terms. For those who were collecting materials, this signal could mean a lot. A white van in a restricted area on the same days as the man's disappearance looked like a potential clue. However, doubts arose from the very beginning. First, the testimony was too vague. There were no details that would allow us to identify the vehicle. No precise description, no special features. Second, the witness himself had a bad reputation. Locals knew him as a man who often abused alcohol. His words were recorded, but they did not receive serious development. The context also played a role. In those places, it happened more than once that local hunters or landowners used the closed roads. Formally, traffic is prohibited, but in practice, vehicles sometimes appeared even in remote areas. Therefore, the white Ford did not look like an exceptional phenomenon to the investigators. As a result, this version did not become a priority. The detail was included in the protocol and marked as unconfirmed. No investigation was assigned, and the owners of such cars were not checked. At that time, the police were already dominated by the accident version, and every new detail was adjusted to fit it. For the family, who later reviewed the documents, this was another proof that the case had been put on hold. They took the fact that the van had appeared more seriously than the investigators. For them, it was a possible sign that Michael could have been taken away by force. In private conversations, his wife said, "If this thread had been pulled back then, we might have already known the truth." But in the official reports, this thread remained forgotten. The white van turned into a line in the case file that few people read. In the following years, it was not even mentioned in updated reports. Time passed, the case went cold. For the police, it was just one of dozens of disappearances that had no clear explanation. For the family, each such detail was a painful reminder that Michael had disappeared for a reason. It was only later, when a new discovery in a remote part of the forest again attracted the attention of investigators, that the line about the white van came back into focus. It began to look not like a random signal, but part of a bigger picture that no one wanted to put together at the time. 5 years have passed since Michael Harrison disappeared. His case file had long been in the archives. Several thin volumes with searchers' reports, photos of the camp, and dry interview protocols. The family continued to remind about themselves, contacting the media, but with each passing year, interest waned. Only occasionally appeared in local newspapers. Idaho tourist missing in the Cascades is still missing. For most people, this story turned into just another statistic. In the summer of 2022, the case received a sudden continuation. That season, the forestry department was implementing a plan to clear debris from old roads. A team of loggers was working in a remote area where tourists usually did not go. It was a narrow strip of forest with dense undergrowth, littered with fallen trees after winter storms. The work lasted for several days. People sawed trunks, pulled away branches, and cleared space for equipment. One of the workers, while raking away branches, came across a strange metal outline peeking out from under the moss. At first, it seemed to be a lid from an old container or a piece of equipment left by previous crews. But when others helped to clear the ground, it became clear. It was a round hatch sunk into a concrete slab. The diameter reached almost a meter. The surface was covered with rust, and the edges were overgrown with a thick layer of moss and grass. The discovery seemed strange at first. There were no military bases or official buildings in that area. No one in the brigade had heard of underground shelters. The hatch looked as if it had not been opened for decades. Its lid was held on by old hinges and did not give way immediately. We had to lift it together, swinging it in different directions. The metal creaked, and the rust fell off in pieces, but eventually, the lid was pushed aside. At the same moment, a pungent smell of dampness escaped from the darkness. The air was stale and heavy, as if from a basement that had not been ventilated for years. Inside, the narrow cavity was dark, with concrete walls sloping down into the unknown. The lumberjacks had no flashlights, so they could only see the upper staircase, which was covered with mold. The bottom stank of dampness and rot. The workers stopped working. They knew well that such findings should not be investigated on their own. Someone immediately called the shift supervisor, and in a few minutes the information went further, to the local department. They decided to call the police and rescuers. They quickly cordoned off the site. No one went downstairs until the police arrived. People stood around, feeling strangely anxious. The very fact that a concrete hatch was found in the middle of a dense forest looked implausible. It looked neither like the remains of Soviet or American military facilities, nor like typical technical manholes. Everyone assumed that it was either an old vault or someone had built the underground structure on their own. When the police arrived, the first thing they did was to record the location. They took pictures of the hatch, its lid, moss, and branches that covered it. Then they carefully looked inside with a flashlight. A narrow concrete staircase led down about 5 meters, and then a small chamber was visible. However, it was impossible to see any details from the surface. Everything merged into a black mass. It was decided to go down only after the rescuers arrived. The damp air could be dangerous, and gases accumulate in underground structures. In addition, no one knew whether the stairs would hold the weight. They left the place under guard and waited for the specialists. news of the trap door quickly spread among those who remembered the Michael Harrison case. Several law enforcement officers immediately recalled that he had disappeared near this site. The coincidence was too strange. Internal comments in the reports sounded cautious. It is possible that the discovery is related to the Harrison case. When the rescuers arrived at the site, careful preparations began. First, they measured the level of gases and found a low oxygen content, which confirmed that it was dangerous to go down without protection. Then they set up ropes, prepared flashlights and cameras. Everyone expected that the answer to the question that had been hanging unanswered for 5 years might be hidden there. But even before the first rescuer went down, the discovery itself had already changed the matter. For the first time since the disappearance, a real object connected to the area where the tourist went missing appeared. The hatch, hidden under moss and soil, pulled an old case out of the archive and forced attention to it. After several hours of preparation, the rescuers finally decided to go down into the dark hole. The hatch was guarded, and police cars and several Forest Service vehicles were already standing around. Everyone was waiting for the result. What exactly the old concrete structure was hiding. The first to go down was a rescuer in protective gear with an oxygen mask and a powerful flashlight. A metal cable held him in place so that he could be lifted up at any time. He walked carefully. The stairs were slippery with condensation, and the concrete walls were covered with mold. Each step echoed in the narrow well. When the light of the lantern pierced the darkness, a small room opened up, about 3 by 3 meters, with bare walls. The floor was covered with dirt and old stains, and there was a rusty iron bed in the corner. A chain with handcuffs embedded in the concrete hung near one of the walls. Canned food cans, some cut open with a knife, and several plastic canisters were scattered on the floor. Everything looked like the room had been used recently, but left in a hurry. Suddenly, the flashlight beam illuminated something that made the rescuer stop. A man was lying on the floor, right next to the chain. His body seemed to be exhausted to the limit. A thin figure, sunken eyes, pale skin. He was alive, barely moving and trying to raise his head. Seconds passed in silence. The rescuer sent a signal upstairs. "We have a man down." It was something no one expected. For all 5 years, the case had been considered hopeless, and now there was a man who had been officially written off as a missing person for a long time. They carefully lifted him up. It took several rescuers to transport him upstairs on a special stretcher. He was so exhausted that he could not move on his own. The medics waiting at the hatch immediately connected the equipment and started administering oxygen. It didn't take long to identify him. It was Michael Harrison. Meanwhile, forensic experts began to examine the room. They recorded every detail. They took pictures of the cans, collected pieces of fabric, and took metal swabs. They were particularly attentive to the stairs. There were several black, grease-like spots on the concrete that stretched from the entrance downward. This showed that people had come down here regularly. Rows of scratches were found on the walls near the place where the chain hung. They were grouped in blocks of 5 notches, like calendar marks. There were hundreds of them. It was a silent diary of survival, the days he counted while staying in the dungeon. The experts noticed another detail. In the upper part of the wall, they could see the remains of a metal pipe that once went out. It was completely overgrown with earth and moss, but this explained how a person could survive here for years. The pipe had once served as a ventilation system, providing minimal access to fresh air. Now it was clogged, and a suffocating atmosphere reigned inside. There was an eerie silence in the cell. Everything looked as if this place had been specially equipped to hold a person. The bed, the handcuffs, the food and water supplies, even the order in which the objects were arranged. It was not a spontaneous shelter or an old basement. It was a cell. When the stretcher with Harrison was brought to the surface, the police recorded, "Alive. Identified." It was a sensation for everyone who still remembered his disappearance. The discovery of the hatch turned a cold case into an active criminal investigation. Now the investigators had not only old protocols and archival reports, but also a living person who could confirm that someone else's will was at work in the mountains. And the cell underground with scratched walls was the first proof of this. After being evacuated from the underground cell, Michael Harrison was immediately taken to the district hospital. His condition was critical: exhaustion, severe dehydration, and severe muscle wasting. Doctors said he was on the verge of death. In the first hours after his rescue, he could not speak. His eyes were constantly wandering, his body shuddered at every sharp sound. It was only a few days later, when his condition stabilized, that investigators were able to ask him the first questions. His testimony was fragmentary, full of pauses and uncertainty. His voice sounded as if he had forgotten how to speak. From the official records, we know that he described the kidnapper as a man who limped and had a pungent odor of grease and solvents. This was a constant detail that accompanied his every appearance. According to Michael, the perpetrator always came wearing a mask that covered his face almost completely. Harrison did not know where the hatch was located. He was kidnapped at night. He remembered coming out of his tent, and suddenly the light of a flashlight hit him in the eye. After that, he felt a short shock and woke up in an underground cell, handcuffed. Some of his testimony was not officially disclosed by the investigation. In public comments, the phrase was heard, "Some circumstances are confidential due to the nature of the violence." This was done intentionally, to protect the victim and prevent the leakage of details that could cause a public outcry. All that is known is that the conditions of detention were brutal. At the same time, technical details became the key to the reconstruction. Harrison described the rhythm of food delivery. He said that sometimes it was every day, sometimes at intervals of 2 or 3 days. Food was brought in tins and plastic cans, some of which were later found in the cell. He also recalled the sound of a metal key. The handcuffs that chained him to the chain were sometimes changed. Once or twice during his detention, the old chain was replaced with a new one. Harrison remembered this sound because it cut through the silence of the cell, where other noises were minimal. According to experts, even these fragments made it possible to draw up a basic profile of the perpetrator. The limp, the smell of grease, and regular trips to the underground facility all added up to a picture. It looked too specific to be accidental. There were calendar notches on the walls of the cell, which confirmed Michael's words. He tried to count the days to keep from going crazy. According to preliminary estimates, there were so many marks that they indicated that he had been held for many months. After a certain point, the marks became uneven and chaotic, as if he was running out of strength. The police officially stated that Harrison's testimony confirmed the fact of abduction and intentional detention. This was a turning point. The case was no longer seen as a disappearance without signs of a crime. It turned into a full-fledged criminal investigation with a suspected kidnapper operating deep in the forest. Only the main points were reported to the public: a limping man, an old van, an underground cell. The rest of the story remained secret. For the family, the main thing was one thing: Michael was alive and could testify. His story became the center of the case, which had been lying dead in the archives for 5 years. The rescued fragments of Michael Harrison's memory became the basis of a new investigation. His words about the kidnapper's limp and the pungent smell of grease provided the direction that had been missing for 5 years. Now, the police hadn't just a disappearance in the mountains, but the testimony of a man who had survived a long detention. The first step was to return to the archives. In the old case, files was an almost forgotten report by a forester about a white van spotted on a closed road in those days. 5 years ago, this document was put aside as unreliable. Now, it has taken on new significance. The analysts pulled up the vehicle databases again. They compiled a list of owners and resales of Ford Econolines in the area for the period covering the time of the tourist's disappearance. Hundreds of records were sifted through gradually, by color, year of manufacture, and method of sale. Particular attention was paid to cases where the vehicles were resold for cash without detailed documentation. At the same time, the Criminal Analytics Department was building a social profile of a possible suspect. 2 details were key: a limp and working with lubricants. This meant that we had to look for people who had leg problems and worked as mechanics, technicians, or with equipment related to lubricants. The filter narrowed the circle to a few dozen names. Among them, one profile stood out: a former car mechanic with a previous assault conviction. His file showed strange coincidences. He lived in a nearby town during those years, owned a white Ford Econoline at the time, and sold it shortly after Harrison's disappearance. The sale took place for cash, without official registration of the new owner. After that, the man disappeared from sight. A check of his history added details. He had lost his job at a service station due to conflicts with co-workers and was living alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Neighbors recalled that he limped after an old leg injury and constantly worked with lubricants, always smelling pungent. These words matched Michael's testimony. Next, the investigators turned to geography. They marked on the map the suspect's old places of residence, the roads he used, and remote forest routes. Several lines converged in the area where the trapdoor was later found. There were maintenance roads that he might have known well from his work as a mechanic for forestry companies. The puzzle was coming together. The forester's archived report, the vehicle database, the social profile, the survivor's testimony, and geography formed a single chain. All the threads led to one person, a car mechanic who suddenly left and changed his place of residence a few years ago. The investigators' findings were included in an updated report. For the first time, it clearly stated, the main suspect in the case is a person known as, with a criminal background, a limp, experience as a mechanic, and a history of owning a white Ford Econoline. The name was not made public, but it became clear to those working on the case that this was no longer an accidental disappearance. Harrison's family received a copy of the investigation's summary. For them, it was the first openly recognized document in years. Michael was the victim of a crime. The empty tent, the trail that broke off among the bushes, the strange hatch, everything now had a logical explanation. For the police, this was only the beginning. They were dealing not just with a suspect, but with a man who could kidnap and hold people for years. And the first evidence they found indicated the case was not limited to one tourist. An updated report with the suspect's profile became the basis for a detention order. After several weeks of surveillance, the task force got on his trail. He was living in a trailer on the outskirts of a small town, off the main roads. His neighbors described him as a reserved and gloomy man who avoided contact. He lived alone, sometimes traveling in an old truck to a car repair shop where he worked part-time but spent most of his time at home. The operation took place early in the morning. Several police cars were pulled up to the trailer and a special forces group took up positions around it. In case of resistance, they prepared shields and stun grenades, but they were not needed. When the door opened, the man came out on his own. He was limping, just as Harrison had described. The suspect was laid on the ground and handcuffed. He did not resist. Then the search began. Inside the trailer was a mess: old furniture, tools, Work clothes. In the closet, they found several sets of coveralls soaked in oil and solvents. The laboratory would later confirm that the composition of these substances matched the chemical traces found in the underground chamber. In a separate room, there were cans of oil and tool kits, screwdrivers, wrenches, and a grinder. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary mechanic's working arsenal, but there were some items that were alarming. In the toolbox, they found a wallet with documents in the name of Michael Harrison. Next to it were a small flashlight and a penknife, which the family confirmed as his belongings. This was not the only trace. Small items were found in the nightstand, a watch of a different brand, a woman's earring, and a broken camera strap. None of these things belonged to Harrison. This could mean that he was not the only victim. Investigators laid everything out on a table and took photos for the evidence catalog. Digital media attracted particular attention: an old laptop and several flash drives. The computer had no internet access, but among the files, they found offline maps of the area. One of them marked a forest area exactly where the hatch was located. This was a direct confirmation that he knew about the camera and used it deliberately. The search continued in a utility shed behind the trailer. Inside were coils of chains and several locks. They matched the shape and size of those found in the underground cell. This coincidence was hard to attribute to chance. Every detail was recorded in the protocols. Forensic scientists worked for hours, labeling bags and packing up evidence. Eventually, a picture emerged. A man with a history of violence, a limp, a job as a mechanic, and the belongings of a missing tourist. The chain of evidence closed on him. The suspect was taken to the police station. He was silent, did not answer questions. The report stated, "Detained without resistance." This was not unexpected for the investigators. He had been acting cautiously for many years, but the moment the case was lifted from the archive was the end for him. After the search, it became clear that it was not just Harrison's case. The small items found could have belonged to other disappeared persons. This opened up a new, even wider scale of the tragedy. But the main thing was different. The police finally had a living person who fit all the descriptions and whose property hid evidence that had been missing for years. After the arrest of the man, who was officially identified as Richard Collins, the investigation entered a new phase. Now, the case file contained not only a name, but also a whole set of evidence that made it possible to speak of him as the main figure. The totality of the findings looked indisputable. The testimony of the rescued tourist matched Collins' profile. A limp, the smell of oil, the way he kept quiet and hid his face. Michael Harrison's belongings were found in the trailer, as well as items that did not belong to him, small remnants of other people's lives. The utility box contained chains and locks of the same type as those used in the underground cell, and digital maps with a marked section of the forest became the final proof that he knew and used the structure deliberately. The prosecutor's office officially charged him with the abduction and torture of Michael Harrison, but the case was not limited to this episode. Investigators went back to the old archives and reviewed several cases of missing tourists in the same county. The similarities were striking: disappearances near closed roads, campsites with no signs of struggle, and no bodies. The MO pointed to Collins. Thus, he was charged with several more episodes, not only kidnapping, but also murder. The report included the phrase, "serial nature of the actions," which for the first time made it clear that this was not an accident, but a systematic activity of a criminal who had been operating in the mountains of Washington for years. For investigators, Harrison remained the key witness. His testimony was crucial. He was the only survivor. It depended on him whether the court would recognize all the facts or whether the lawyers would try to question the details. Despite his exhausted condition, he agreed to testify at the trial. The manhole was officially recognized as a converted old technical structure. According to the documents, it was once a partial underground tank left behind after work in the forest. Collins found it, disguised it, and adapted it for the camera. What to others was an abandoned concrete pile in the woods became a crime scene for him. When the case became public, photos of the rusted lid were published in all major publications. The manhole became a symbol of horror. For some, it was a reminder of the fragility of safety in the mountains. For others, it was proof that even after years of silence, the truth can come out. For Harrison's family, it was a moment of relief. After 5 years of uncertainty, they had a living son and husband. Yes, he went through inhuman ordeals. But now, his testimony has stopped a man who is likely to be responsible for several more tragedies. Collins remained silent during the interrogations. He did not admit guilt and did not give any explanation. His limp, his past as a mechanic, and the things he found spoke for him. In court, prosecutors emphasized, "This is a classic example of how a systematic underestimation of details led to a 5-year delay in the truth." This was a lesson for the police. A detail noted by a drunken forester and dismissed as unreliable turned out to be the key to the case. It was not developed at the time, but it has come to life now that there is a living witness and real evidence. The mountains of Washington have regained their silence, but a different kind of silence, filled with the memory of the trapdoor that hid the man for years. In their final statements, the prosecutors emphasized that the Collins case was not only about a crime, but also about justice, even if it was delayed. For the community, this story is a reminder that no one disappears without a trace. For Harrison's family, it's proof that even through the years and archival silence, the truth can be found. And for Michael himself, it is a hard testament to the fact that survival sometimes becomes the only form of struggle.